chapter 26, and we're going to begin with verse 7. And as we have studied through verse 8 and now to verse 9, he is going to talk about the use of how to handle a fool. And do you suppose that most of us in times in our life have difficulty with fools? What is a fool? How do you know that you met one then? What is a fool? Okay, lacks common sense. He acts more on impulse than on intelligence. And that's why he talks about his rejection of knowledge and understanding and things such as that. There's so much that Solomon has to say about the fool, and he's going to morph that into talking about the lazy along with him. So let's begin with verse 9. Like a thorn that goes into the hand of a drunkard is a proverb in the mouth of fools. Now, for just a moment, what do you mean when you say a thorn going into the hand of a drunkard? Anybody? What's the thought in mind there? First of all, he probably doesn't feel it. Then, he doesn't take care of it. Do you remember in Proverbs chapter 23, verse 35, he said, "They have struck me, but I was not hurt. They beaten me, but I did not feel it." So a drunk person can actually be injured and never have a clue that they've been injured because they're under the influence of that alcohol. On the other hand, he's talking about their use of a proverb, or the use of a proverb in the mouth of a fool. Notice here he has a proverb, and chapter 26 and verse 7, we just covered that last week. He said, "Like the legs of the lame hang limp is a proverb in the mouth of fools." What good are the legs of a person who's lame? Well, they just basically are carrying them around. Well, they do not know how to handle a proverb any more than the drunk man knows how to handle a thorn in him. First of all, he probably doesn't know what it's there. And then second of all, if he did know what was there, how would he be able to get it out? Well, you put a proverb in the mouth of a fool, and he doesn't know what to do with it, and he doesn't know how to properly use it. I go to the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verse 11. "The words of the wise are like goads, and the words of the scholars are like well-driven nails given by one shepherd." You put a proverb, you put a message in the mouth of a wise man, and everybody's able to get something from it. But you put a proverb in the mouth of a fool, and it actually has no benefit whatsoever. How many of you have ever listened to someone who didn't know what they were doing try to tell a joke, and they couldn't remember the punchline? They start telling you the joke, and they say, "I'm sorry, I forgot what the joke was." Or maybe they tell the punchline, and then they're like, "Oh, I messed it all up." I promise it was funny, yeah. Well, you put a proverb in the mouth of a fool, and it's the same way. It has no benefit and no value whatsoever. And I think Solomon is trying to talk about what fools do, and you really don't pay a whole lot of attention to them. Okay, let's go to verse 10. "The great God who formed everything gives the fool his hire and the transgressor his wages." Now, you may find that another translation translates this differently. Because if you're looking in the New King James, of course, I've just put it on the screen, but if you'll notice the word God is in italics, which means that's what the translator supplied there. And the original word here is the word for an archer or great or high commander. So the word great here could be an archer. You know, the adjective here. And then it says the second word of significance is this word here that is gives the fool his hire and the transgressor his wages. The word formed is also the word that is translated pierced. So some translations will say basically the archer who pierces everything is the same as the one who gives his hire to the fool, or gives the fool his hire and transgressor his wages. And you say, well, what's your point that you're trying to bring out of that? What would happen if you had an archer who was just doing like this? Would you be afraid that he would let the arrow go and it might hit you? That is the way that some would translate that. And it's almost like, how many of you have ever been with somebody who's never owned a gun, never used a gun, and you hand it to them, and the next thing they do, they say, oh, let's, and you're like, whoa, I think that's the idea. When you pair that with verse 9, putting a proverb in the mouth of a fool does what? It can actually become dangerous. Now, if the translators of the New King James got it correct here, talking about the great God who formed, it's like God rewards everybody according to their works, whether it's the fool his hire or the transgressor his wages. That's true as well, and the Bible teaches that in a number of passages. In fact, some of the passages that I referred to this morning. Okay, let's go to verse 11. As a dog returns to his own vomit, so a fool repeats his folly. How many of you have ever seen what Solomon is describing here? Dog throws up, and what does he do? He goes back and he laps it up again. And how do most of us feel about that? It's just nasty, Don't you get around me after you do that. But that's a common trait of animals, particularly wild animals, where they eat anything. What he says, the fool does that to repeat his folly. It's just as disgusting when a fool does the same thing. Now, Peter, in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 20 through 22, compares that to what? Going back into the world. After we've received a knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin. And he's talking about with these people, the latter state is worse than the first. It would have been better for them than having known the holy commandment delivered to them to turn back. He says, these people here who are doing this, he said it's just like a sow that was washed to the wallowing in the mire and a dog returning to his own vomit. So when people who are Christians go back to the world, what are they showing themselves to be? A fool here. That's what they're showing, is the folly of what they are doing. Let's go to verse 12 now. Yeah. And, if a person has already rejected what they know to be right, it's not like you can teach them anything. It's a matter of choice then. It's not a matter of knowledge. It's a matter of choice. Okay, let's go to verse 12 now. Do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him. Now, what do you mean when you say a man wise in his own eyes? He thinks he knows everything. And he believes he's right about everything. Now, I think most of us believe that we're right about what we believe, but I don't think most of us would say, I know it all. There's others who have more knowledge than I do, and I'm willing to listen and to learn. But the man who is wise in his own eyes, you can't tell him anything because he thinks he already knows the answer. There's been a time or two, people will call me up and say, Tony, can you help me with my computer? And I'll say, well, I'll see what I can do. And then they come and I'll say, okay, now, did you do this? No, that's not the way you do it. I'm like, okay. you know, you want to do it your way, fine. You don't need me. And, well, that didn't work. Well, then let me offer you another option. But people sometimes don't want to listen because they already think they know the answer to it. Well, Solomon says this man is worse than a fool because you absolutely cannot teach him anything because he already knows it all. Let me offer you some reflection. Going back earlier in this chapter, in chapter 26 and verse 5, you remember he says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be what? Wise in his own eyes. There are times when you can make a person be quiet when you prove them wrong. And in some cases, when a man is acting foolish, what you do, you show them their foolishness. But verse 16, I think, is also very important. We're not there yet, but he says, the lazy man is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. But let's take one more. Let's go to chapter 28 and verse 11. And he says, the rich man is wise in his own eyes, but the poor who has understanding searches him out. The rich man is wise in his own eyes. Why are rich people generally people difficult to tell anything? Okay. Many people think the reason why I have wealth is because how smart I am. And do you remember what Solomon says? The race is not always to the swift. The battle is not always the strong, nor favor to men of riches, but time and chance happens to them all. And sometimes people are wealthy because they were in the right place at the right time in front of the right people who put them in that place. Of course, they willingly forget that. They don't acknowledge the fact that someone actually put them in that position. They want to think it's by their own, but he says here, this is man is wise in their own eyes. Go back to chapter 3 and verse 7. He says, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. Do not be wise in your own eyes. I think God is recommending humility to all of us. How important is humility with regards to listening and learning something? Okay, elaborate on very. Okay. There's times you have to put yourself into the lesser position to say, here's a person, who knows a whole lot more than I do, and sometimes they even know more than I do about something which I'm trained in. You want me to tell you one of the most humiliating, humiliating is not the right word, the most humbling things of every new preacher. You start out, you go to school, you're trained, you come out and you feel like you're going to slay the world, and you go into Bible class, and a dear, sweet sister sitting there with her Bible, and you make a comment and she corrects you, and then you know what? You're like, I feel like a fool. Now the question is, will you be humble enough to admit there's stuff I don't know, and to go beyond that I don't know to what can I learn from this? And I think Solomon is hitting at the question, don't be wise in your own eyes. And he would say, if you really want to be wise, listen to God. He knows it all. And also listen to the counsel of others. Verse 13. The lazy man says, there's a lion in the road, a fierce lion in the streets. Why is he saying that? What's that? So he doesn't have to get out and do anything? Well, justify his laziness. Well, let's go back to chapter 22 and look at verse 13. You have to put these two together because he's got to justify himself. The lazy man says, there's a lion outside, I will be slain in the streets. Now, when you put this here, he says there's a lion in the road, a fierce lion. Why is he saying, I'm afraid I may end up getting slain out there? Well, what happens? Pretty soon you can find an excuse for everything. One thing I think the pandemic did was it gave people an opportunity to excuse everything. I can't go outside. I can't meet people. If I do, I'm going to get that dreaded disease. Okay? There's a place for legitimate concern. If your immunity system is down, if you've been sick, well, yes, But what happens after a period of time is many people have decided, hey, that'll work, excuse work all the time. And so what am I going to do? Nothing. Because you're going to constantly, and what type of man? This here is a lazy man. Solomon had no sympathy for fools, and he had no sympathy for lazy people who are constantly trying to bring excuses. Now I'm going to again jump ahead to verse 16, 26:16, where he says, the lazy man is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. And we're going to cover that here in just a moment as we get to verse 16. Okay, let's go to verses 14 and 15 together. As a door turns on its hinges, so does the lazy man on his bed. The lazy man buries his hand in the bowl, and it wearies him to bring it back to his mouth. Do you suppose that Solomon had a sense of humor? Is there a time to see the humor in some of the scriptures? Yes. I think some people have the idea that there's no humor at all, but God here inspired Solomon to talk about a lazy man, and he pictures him as being on hinges to his bed. Every time I read this, I think about the piano hinge. You know what a piano hinge is? Joe does. It's a hinge that the top of it opens and closes like this. I just visualize a person on a twin bed with a hinge like a piano hinge, and he gets up and he lays down, gets up and he lays down. He's attached to his bed. Now, there's a reason for him using that. You go back to chapter 6 and look at verses 9 and 10. He says there, "How long will you slumber, O sluggard? When will you arise from sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep." Is there anything wrong with a person laying down and sleeping at night? No. In fact, God designed our bodies to need that rejuvenation every night. But have you ever seen somebody who was so lazy they would never get off the couch? Yep. Sometimes I wonder if y'all are hearing me. Yeah, I mean, if Chris Whitaker was here, he'd say, "Hello, walls." Lights and walls. Well, he's gotten more sophisticated. It used to just be walls. Now it's lights and walls. But the idea of a person being sleepy all the time. Well, then he uses one that is even more comical to me, is the fact that here's a lazy man who won't even feed himself. And back in chapter 19 and verse 24, it says there, "A lazy man buries his hand in the bowl and will not so much as bring it to his mouth again." Here he said it wearies him. That reminds me of the old phrase, a man was so lazy he was dying because he hadn't had anything to eat. The man got to feeling sorry for him. Had a big old wagon of corn he had picked. And he carried it over to him. And he says, "I'm feeling sorry for you. Here's your whole wagon of corn." He says, "Is it shucked? You know, you gonna feed it to him?" I went on a visitation once with Jim Slatton, a benevolent call, and actually was where the Northside Apartments are up here now, but there was a trailer park there, and Jim and I got there, and Jim went and knocked on the door, and he told me, he said, "We're here, we're from Bobby Branch, we brought you some food." The guy was sitting in a chair wearing just a pair of shorts, had a big bag of Cheetos, munching down on Cheetos. He said, "Well, you can just bring them in, put them on the counter over here." And that hit Jim just like that. And he said, "If you want these groceries, you get out here and get them." He said, "If not, I'm taking them back." And of course, initially it shocked me as much as it, I guess as it did the guy. Like, wow, I can't believe Jim just said that. But his point, I mean, we're not talking about a guy who was lame in his feet or who was, incapable. We're talking about a guy who was probably in his 30s, who was sitting there watching TV, and he just wanted somebody to bring him some food. He didn't even want to get up and put it in his house. Jim fussed about that all the way back to the church building too. But I look at this and I see a man, it says here, he buries his hand in the bowl and it wearies him to bring it back to his mouth. In other words, he's so lazy he doesn't even want to feed himself. And that's a sad picture there. Anybody have any comments on these? Okay, let's go to verse 16. This is one I've referred to several times. "The lazy man is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly." Now, I've talked about the phrase wise in his own eyes. And 9 times in the book of Proverbs, Solomon refers to a man wise in his own eyes. Chapter 3, verse 7, 12:15, 16:2, 21:2, 26:5, 12:16, 28:11, and 30, verse 12. And what it is, Solomon knows there are people who think they're wiser than they are, but then he compares it to 7 men who can answer sensibly. Why 7 men? 7 was a complete number. We use the number 100 or 10 quite often because of we live in our country on the base 10 system. I think everybody didn't have a clue what I just said. But we live on a base 10 where, it's multiples of 10. But in their case, the number 7 always meant complete. 7 men who can answer sensibly. They can think about what something is correct or wrong or needs to be done or doesn't need to be done. He said, lazy man's wiser in his own eyes than 7 of those who can answer sensibly. Now I want to move to verses 17 through verse 28. I know we won't cover that much today, but this section relates to conflict and the tongue. And would you agree that the tongue can create more problems than anything else? In a church, where do problems generally arise? Most of the time, it's yak, 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 yak. And James, in James chapter 3, addresses the use of the tongue and how he talks about it's a world of iniquity, set on fire by hell. It's a restless evil. No man can tame the tongue. And yet in chapter 1, he says, if any man thinks himself to be religious and does not bridle his tongue, this man's religion is useless. Solomon, in verses 17 through 28, is going to talk about the use of the tongue. Now, when I get to verse 17, this is a verse that I have used a lot. He who passes by and meddles in a quarrel not his own is like a man who takes a dog by the ears. What does it mean to meddle? Okay, stick your nose in where it doesn't belong. How does a person meddle? How do you do that, though? I'm here to give you some advice. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't ask for your advice. Here is a man, notice now, he comes and he meddles in a what? A quarrel, not his own. You can go over here and you can see 2 people arguing with one another about something, and you say, here, let me help you guys out. Who are you looking for, Willie? Okay. I thought you were looking for somebody. Okay. Absolutely you are. Yeah, your advice is going to be the one that's going to be the wrong regardless in all of this. Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you the second question before I go to review the first part of this again. What happens when you take a dog by the ears? Most of them are going to bite you. And so what the sum and substance is, you get involved in a quarrel that doesn't belong to you, you're going to get hurt in all of this. The reason why I say I've used this verse, I've had people come to me and say, Tony, our family is having trouble. We're trying to resolve our inheritance. And this brother of mine, this sister of mine, this cousin of mine isn't doing what I want him to do. And I say, let me take you to a passage in the book of Proverbs. And I say, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to get involved. It makes them mad at you right then. But in the long run, I will tell you, they'll usually be thankful that you didn't get involved. And someone says, oh, but you can give them wise advice. Turn with me to Luke chapter 12 and verse 14. Luke 12, verse 14. Because if they don't accept Proverbs 26:17, then I say, well, let me take you to Luke chapter 12, verse 14. There's a man who's come and said, Lord, bid my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Could the Lord have said who's right and who's wrong? But how did he respond? What he said to him, man, who made me a judge or an arbiter over you? If the Lord refused to get involved in an inheritance dispute, what business do I have getting involved in an inheritance dispute? Do you understand the principle of that? It's something that does not belong. And sometimes there's value in those people working their own problems out. If the quarrel's not your own, then you don't try to solve it. Now, there's something else that's to add to this. Let's go to 2 Timothy to chapter 2 and verses 23 and 24. 2 Timothy 2, 23 and 24. And Paul says, but avoid foolish and ignorant disputes, knowing that they generate strife. And a servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but be gentle to all, able to teach, patience. In verse 23, what is he telling you about some disputes? Okay, what adjectives does he use to describe them? Foolish and ignorant. Somebody doesn't know what's going on, that's why they're ignorant. Foolish means you don't think about how bad this is going to turn out. Best thing to do is don't get involved in them. And then he says, the servant of the Lord must not quarrel. Don't get, what I find is often people who get involved in a quarrel, next thing they're the third person shouting. So avoid that. Well, let me offer some advice here. Let's go to 1 Thessalonians, to chapter 4 and verses 11 and 12. And then we'll go to 3:11 of 2 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians 4, 11 and 12. He says that you also aspire to lead a quiet life. And what's the next phrase? Ray, tell me what it says. To mind your own business. Did you realize the Bible says to mind your own business? How important is that? That you work with your own hands as we command you, and that you walk properly toward those who are on outside, that you may lack nothing. You go to 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 11, and he says, for we hear that some who walk among you are in a disorderly manner, not working at all, but are busybodies. Now I'm going to tie all this together. He's just talked about the lazy man, the lazy man, the lazy man. Who's the guy always ready to offer advice? The man who doesn't have any work to do on his own. If you get a busy man and you go to him and say, hey, I need you to talk with us about this. I'm sorry, I got work to do. You're going to have to work this out on your own. But a lazy man says, oh, yeah, I can resolve that for you. Here's what I do. I think Solomon is hitting at practicality here. And that is, you mind your own business, you stay out of other people's matters, and you try to resolve problems in your own life rather than try to resolve problems in other people's lives. I've observed a lot of people get entertained by conflict. If that wasn't true, Facebook wouldn't exist. I'm serious. I mean, you know, some people use Facebook for a good purpose. I hope that we're trying to do that. But there's some people who just love the conflict. Alan, you had something that you wanted to add? Okay. Okay, let's go to verses 18. There's a quarrel. In other words, we're talking about people who are out here who are in a quarrel. Let's say Willie and Alan are out there in the lobby and they're trying to decide who makes the best motorcycle. And then here I come along and I'd say, yeah, guys, let me resolve that for you. And next thing you know, who's going to be involved in the argument? I would be. In Galatians 6, though, he says, if a brother be overtaken in a trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, meekness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. I think it's, you know, that's quite a big difference of trying to help someone who's struggling with a fault than trying to insert yourself into something that's none of your business. Okay. I don't know. He asked if that's a sensitive part of a dog. I would assume so. You know, because if you pull on them, you're going to get bit. I know that. But I just made a practice. I don't pull on dogs' ears, and I don't get involved in other people's arguments. I would say there would be. Okay, let's take verses 18 and 19. That's about all we're going to have time for today. Like a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death, is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, I was only joking. Now, let's go back to verse 18. What is a madman? Somebody not in their right mind. They have lost any sense of, their behavior is irrational. They're not thinking about what they're doing. They're not contemplating. Now, what he is doing, he is throwing firebrands. You know what a firebrand is? Well, it's actually a burning coal of wood. And that was actually used frequently in battles. They would throw firebrands. Yes. Okay, Samson tied to the tail of the foxes. Then arrows, and that brings about death. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you want to be around a guy who is wielding something deadly? And I mentioned earlier to you, a guy, you hand him a gun, and even though it's not loaded, he starts doing this, and what do? Take it away from him? I usually say, ho, 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 watch where you're pointing that. Toward the ground. Oh, okay. And then they start, let me look and see. And then you're like, a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death is the man who deceives his neighbor. In other words, to deceive someone is to tell them a lie. But then after he tells a lie, he says, I was only joking. Now, what is going on here is a person who's careless with the truth. They're not considering how much danger can be had in telling a lie, and what ends up happening, it ends up creating harm and hurt. How many people have actually been hurt with practical jokes? And the person has to realize that. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop here, because next week we'll pick up with verse 20, and we'll finish the chapter next week.